Good morning, everyone. This is Mario Hardy, the CEO of the Pacific Asia Travel Association. And today I'm actually joined by Dr. Parag Khanna, who is a futurist, a scientist, an advisor to governments, an author of several interesting books. And a discussion we'll have today on one of his latest books that he actually wrote called Connectography, or wrote some time ago, which I think is really relevant to today's situation with COVID-19. And we'll come up and talk about this a little bit later on. But Dr. Parag, please just introduce yourself a little bit more about some of the activities you're working on and maybe some of your latest initiatives.
It's so great to speak with you, Mario, and thank you for inviting me on. I'm a traveler at heart. I was actually doing a written interview recently, and I was asked, how would you describe yourself, or what quote best defines you? I said, first and foremost, I'm a traveler, and I sort of live by the motto, I travel, therefore I am. And I think I was, sort of just born with this condition, you will, so it's very appropriate to be speaking with you. But I am a social scientist, a political scientist, an academic. I've done a lot of work with governments around the world, the US, Europe, and Asia. I live now in Singapore. My books are, largely concerned with globalization. You might even say the geopolitics of globalization, the competition. But I look a lot at economic issues for sure around national development strategies, the role of the services industry. Obviously, hospitality and tourism fits in very strongly there. I have a strong interest in human capital, talent. How do we develop and nurture talent? And the next book that I'm writing is actually about the future of human geography, which is to say migration. And I'm trying to answer the question, if there are 9 billion people in the world in the year 2050, where will we live? Why will we be where we will be? How did we get there? And those are some of the big kinds of questions that I like to tackle.
I had the pleasure a few months ago to meet you in person. We're actually now having these virtual discussions due to the current situations. But I met you, your wife, and your daughter, and you have a very special family. Your wife is one of the leading minds in artificial intelligence. Your daughter, 10 years old, is the CEO of a travel company called Okta. A very interesting family, and I just can't imagine the type of conversation you have around that at dinner table.
Well, I think we have in contrast to the esteemed description you've just given, we have quite frankly, the silliest conversations imaginable at the dinner table. It's probably a good relief or respite from, coding and computer science and math, homework. And for me, writing and researching and having my head buried in books all day. So we're pretty lighthearted. And given the current lockdown, our cherished hour is just exercising together, kind of exercising in yoga and, sort of like tripping over each other like a big game of Twister. But, I think I don't think that neither my wife, Aisha, nor I set out to be entrepreneurs. We're definitely very different kinds of entrepreneurs. She's very into technology, and I do more kind of, consulting and advisory with official institutions. And Zara, our daughter you mentioned, is, what she does, she gets the traveling from me, and she gets the coding and the computer science from her mom. So basically her chatbot Okta is this fusion of the love of travel and this sort of education in technology.
Excellent. Well, actually, all have a very fascinating family, and I'd love to have invite you all for dinner next time you come to Bangkok, so we can explore more of these discussions. One of the reasons I reached out to you today is that recently I started to actually read your book called Connectography, which I found absolutely fascinating. I'm about a quarter, halfway into the book at the moment, and can't wait to go back to it and read the rest of it. But I'm going to read a quote for you, and just like you to explore this a little bit more from your book. It says, "Connectography is ahead of the curve in seeing the battlefield of the future and a new kind of tug of war being waged on it. Khanna's scholarship and foresight are world-class and must read for the next president, Chuck Hagel, former US Secretary of Defense." Where the idea of this book, Connectography, came from, and can you explain to us in simple words what connectography is actually mean to you?
Sure. So it's a fusion, right, of two words, connectivity and geography. And, in a way, that book is the culmination of, again, many years of just reflecting on this intersection of geopolitics and globalization. So globalization is kind of the embodiment of all of that connectivity we have, all of that infrastructure, all of the highways and railways and oil and gas pipelines and internet cables. All of that is the infrastructure, the physical backbone of global connectivity. And then we have geopolitics, the competition for power, for supply chains, for resources, to build industries, military power. And what I find is that we compete much more over that connectivity than we do over borders, right? There are very few actual active, hostile, international border conflicts in the world today, maybe just one or two. But that tug of war that you mentioned, that tug of war is that competition over a rope. I mean, the sport tug of war, as I talk about in the book, is this 10,000-year-old sport. It's the oldest team sport in the world, is tug of war. There are cave drawings depicting people waging tug of war. And to me, it's a fascinating metaphor because it's really about fighting over something that connects us. And we're connected, so universally connected by infrastructure and supply chains. And we're competing every minute. So we're not competing over borders anymore. We're competing over supply chains, right? Who makes the most medical devices and ventilators? Who has the largest share of the automotive market? Who controls the supply of the world's semiconductors? That's what countries and cities, nations, empires are fighting over right now, every second of every day. Where are the internet cables? Where are the servers? Where is the data being housed? All of that is tug of war over connectivity. So we've gone from a war between systems. If you remember, the Cold War was a war between two systems, two rival blocs that were divided from each other. Today, we live in this one collective, connected system. And we have war within that system, to control that connectivity. So that's the underlying premise of the book. And as you know, I kind of, go through it with a lot of maps and visualizations that kind of bring to life this connectivity.
I'm actually in another section of your book where we talk about globalizations, and certainly for the last decade or so, we've been promoting globalizations, working more together, more connectivity, as you mentioned, and etc. But don't you feel that the current sentiment with the U.S. president and other countries in Europe also, there is more of this nationalistic point of view where people are focusing on making their country great again, and is that a contradiction to the concept of globalization?
Yes and no. For one thing, every country should want to make itself great, right? So I suppose that in and of itself, the phrase is not harmful, but obviously the way it's used by the Trump administration connotes a certain jingoism, nationalism, which is different from patriotism, right? Patriotism is being proud of your country, and everyone, ideally lives in a country about which they can be proud. But nationalism is saying, me at the expense of you. And that actually doesn't really work very well for America, given how connected it is to the rest of the world. So it actually has negative consequences. And so there are two things that I want to point out in response to your question. The first is that not every country is acting in that way. And we do have a bias, as English speakers coming from the Anglo-American world, towards thinking that what we say is representative of the world, because we hear ourselves speaking to each other in English and reading the New York Times, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and The Economist. But the truth is that that's about 8% of the human population. And not everyone in those countries, in any case, agrees with the policies. Trump lost the popular vote, right, in his own country, in America. So I think we have to be very clear that there's a big difference between, what a leader says and whether it's representative, what a leader says and does and whether it's even good for his country in the first place, and whether or not that leader, whether it's Trump or Brexit, or whatever, is actually represents what the world is doing. Because I can say fairly definitively that what the world is doing is building more connectivity. We can have 10 nationalist leaders in the world who grab the headlines, but the fact is that those countries are trying to export more. They're trying to attract more investment. They're trying to draw in talent. And all of these other things that actually are all about globalization and connectivity. So I think that we have to be really clear, about our terms and what they mean, and what people say, what they do, and whether or not that's actually representative. So there are actually these sort of, trends that are so much deeper. Building connectivity, building infrastructure, are trends that are so much deeper. We're talking about 10,000-year trends, and Trump is neither a blip nor a footnote, in comparison to the power of those trends.
In your book, you also talk about obviously the future and also about technology, and we talk about the Internet of Everything, or the Internet of Things, Internet of People, and how our world is actually getting even more connected, as you mentioned before. I'm not as an expert as your wife is, but I am fascinated by artificial intelligence. That's something I've been studying too and working with. But how do you see AI and also the Internet of Things? And we know that many businesses around the world now are actually trying to develop ways for getting the entire world access to the Internet, even people in remote areas. How do you think the world will change with this extraordinary connectivity that we'll all have access to in the near future?
Well, we are getting closer and closer to universal internet access, because we are almost at universal mobile phone access, and that those phones are increasingly smartphones, and those phones are increasingly connected to not just 3G or 4G, but eventually 5G networks. So we're not that far away from a world in which every individual, or at least every family, has a 5G mobile phone and a smartphone. So that means everyone will have internet access. So, and no doubt that the falling cost of communications and technology and hardware and deregulation has brought us towards that world where the mobile phone is the most universally distributed technology in human history. Many people have cited this sort of statistic that far more people have mobile phones than access to fresh water or toilets in the world. And I think that's obviously tells us something about our kind of, ethical priorities, but it also is just a fact. So, AI ultimately is, using collecting and training data to learn and to anticipate and to substitute and to do certain functions. So the more people are online, the more people are connected, the more access to data there is, the more we can learn about our behavior, anticipate our behavior, and train algorithms to support us in some ways, to replace us in other ways. So I think these things go hand in hand, universality of technology and developing AI to support our needs. So let's take an obvious current example, and that is, anticipating the outbreak of pandemics. So, this goes back at least 10 years, but just by tracking Google searches for symptoms of flu. So individual people go online and they type in words like, I think I have the flu, or what are the symptoms of the flu? And, by searching that metadata anonymously, suddenly, from an immunological perspective, epidemiological perspective, we're able to say, hey, I'm seeing a signal here. We think there might be something wrong in that zip code, in that town. Let's go figure out what's going on. So that is partially, a result of machine learning, algorithms.
Yeah, I think also, the company I worked with before I joined PATA, we were tracking all flights around the world in real time. And we had developed a piece of application software that was able to kind of predict how fast a pandemic would actually, spread on a global basis, based on its point of origin. And it was fascinating because the way it was built, we could actually go back into 40 years of history and just zoom in on one city or one country around the world, and then just track it, slide it all the way over to the current year, and see how fast the increase of air connectivity has increased over that period of time. The sheer volume of flights on a daily basis flying across the world But at the same time, also the scary part was to actually see that the moment the pandemic is declared in one place, how fast it could actually spread on a global basis. And today we're actually we're going to that situation at the moment.
Oh, absolutely. So, you're reminding me that when I saw that a couple of the major COVID-19 hotspots were Italy and Iran, it brought me back to the 14th century, because when the plague broke out, the Black Death, it spread from China westward along the Silk Roads. It devastated the Iranian population, the Persian population at the time, and it entered Europe through the port of Genoa in Italy. And so Italy suffered massively from the Black Death, and Persia suffered massively from the Black Death. And I couldn't help but draw the comparison. Now, that played out actually over 5 years, and here it plays out over 5 days, or 5 weeks, you might say. So that's the impact of accelerated connectivity on things that might have happened anyway, but taken much more time to play out. And that makes the system, the global system, much more complex, because you have these feedback loops that spread globally much more rapidly. That doesn't make, I just want to point out globalization a bad thing. And, there's a long section of connectography where I talk about this. I say, look, there's the positive and the negative sides, right? The fact that we can speak to each other over Zoom, the fact that we can travel around the world and be with, family and friends, and, never lose touch, and share global resources. Such as we do, is all the result of connectivity and globalization. But at the same time, you can have cyber hacking spread globally, pandemic spread globally, terrorists spread globally as well, as a result of some of the same pathways. And so, it's not that globalization is good or bad. We have to learn to manage it better. And we manage it through the forces of flow and friction, right? You allow the good things to flow, but you create friction for the bad things. And friction can be borders, right? Borders or checkpoints and controls. And if we get better at imposing these frictions on the bad things, but enabling the flow of the good things, then we will improve the way in which we manage globalization.
I'd like to come back to the current situation in a few minutes, but first, there was something in your book that I actually found really interesting, and I wanted to expand on it a little bit more. It said by 2030, more than 70% of the world's people will live in cities, and with most of them located within 50 miles of the sea. How will this actually transform our way of living moving forward, and our movements of people moving forward?
It's a great question. And so, that isn't my prediction per se, but it's a kind of extrapolation that many people have cited based on existing trends. Urbanization is a very robust trend. The fact that we congregate around bodies of water or coastal areas is obviously a historical reality. But if you think about climate change, right, we have to potentially reverse that trajectory. So, living in Ho Chi Minh City or Manila or Jakarta, many of the world's coastal mega cities are in Asia. Many of them are vulnerable to rising sea levels. And even though their populations are growing now, it could well be that if climate change accelerates, then those populations will have to retreat somewhat. And we'll have to think about new geographies of settlement. So we may still be urbanizing, but we probably won't necessarily move en masse to the same places. We may need to move to new places, higher elevation, for example, more inland. So, will we continue to feel the urge to live together, in cities? Yes, that is a 7,000-year-old phenomenon. And it's probably going to continue. But will we have to relocate our cities because of climate change? That's also true.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I personally actually been living in cities for most of my life, and the thing I can't wait to do is when I retire to actually move outside of this city as far as possible from a city, and which is probably the opposite of what most other people are doing at the moment. In your book, you say that connectivity is destiny. Well, what did you mean by that?
That is in some ways the thesis or the punchline, or kind of a foundation of the argument. And again, I was looking for what are the things that you can genuinely say universally across time about the human species? And that's a fairly bold, sort of undertaking, but it's actually not a very difficult question to answer, as it turns out. You can't say that we share language or religion or ethnicity or race or ideology. None of those things do we share universally as humans. What you can say for absolutely certain about the last 10,000 years of human history, or the last 60,000 years since we began spreading across the continents, the only thing you can definitively say is that we build connectivity with whatever tool available to us, whether it is stone or whether it is steel. We use whatever technology we have at our disposal to connect to each other. We congregate in cities and settlements, and we build infrastructure to connect those settlements to each other. That is literally, I cannot think of anything other than the biological commonality that we have that you can say is true about human behavior as a collective, as the 8 billion of us alive today. And so that's not just some kind of hypothesis, that's actually a fact about us as humans. So it's so important to recognize this, because it's also anthropologically important. Because if you think about the way a lot of people talk about humanity, we say, well, we are tribal, we divide ourselves up by our skin color, by our race, and so forth. Well, the truth is, that might be true in many places, but it's not universally true. Otherwise, if that were true, then how could it be that today the nation state, the ethnically pure nation state, is becoming decreasingly the norm? More and more countries are multi-ethnic, right? Have more diverse populations, have more immigration, have a higher percentage of foreign-born residents, right? Have more intermarriage, what you could actually call, genetic dilution is happening voluntarily around the world. So you can't say that we are inherently tribal, but you can say that almost the entire population, is connected and getting more and more physically connected to each other. And that's not the result of anyone forcing us to do it. This is literally voluntary. This is the sum total of all of our voluntary behavior over tens of thousands of years. So I genuinely believe that connectivity is an impulse. It is an innate part of who we are, is to connect to each other. And that, to me, is, again, it is truly the deepest statement we can say about ourselves. And therefore, connectivity is truly our destiny, is to become more and more and more connected. And by the way, when you do retire and move as far away from a city as possible, you're going to be connected, because we've connected every single place. You're going to have, mesh network, 5G, satellite, Wi-Fi, and you'll still be in touch. You will be connected.
Oh, I don't get me wrong. I don't want to be disconnected from the world in any way, but I do appreciate nature very much. And being in lockdown now for almost a month, I actually do miss the blue color of the oceans and the greens of the forest, and I really miss nature. And I think that's probably the first thing I'll do as soon as we come out of this lockdown, is to find nature as quickly as possible. I'd like now to move on to talk about the current situation, but also you and I and your daughter and my sons actually share a common passion, which is travel. I know that with your family, you've traveled extensively, as I did. I'm actually now at country number 99. So I was looking forward to do my 100, but I guess I'll have to wait a bit longer for that.
What will your number 100 be? What will your number 100 be?
Many people on social media and friends who know about my country count have been asking me this question, and I honestly do not know. There are so many places I really want to go, and I haven't really made up my mind as to where it would be.
Let me know if you want any tips.
Sure.
I'm the resident travel advisor for everyone.
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, Iran is one country that I would really love to go, but sadly, with the current situation, it's not only the current situation, but also the situation with travel restrictions to Iran. It's probably a bit difficult. One that I'm actually quite intrigued by is Saudi, which now is actually open to tourism again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's certainly actually one on the top of my list to go and explore. I've got some good friends in Saudi who shared some beautiful pictures of many places of the ancient Nabatean cultures and heritage, um, and there are so many other places I'd love to
Yeah,
travel.
Iran is
Yeah.
magical. You know, it
Mm.
was on my sort of bucket list for a long time, and I'm so grateful that I did get a chance to go and to kind of experience firsthand the culture, the pride, the heritage that the country has to offer. To meet so many young people because it is an overwhelmingly young country. You know, so I treasure that one time that I spent about 10 days there, and I wrote a number of articles, you know, from that trip. Saudi also is obviously a fascinating country, and you know, much more complex, obviously, than a lot of outside coverage of it suggests. You mentioned the Nabateans, you know, and it's so funny because we're given the lockdown, we're watching Lawrence of Arabia, which is a 4 hour long movie. And so we're watching it with the kids in parts and kind of explaining the history of the, you know, Ottoman Empire and the tensions with the Arab tribes. So we're up at the parts actually where where Lawrence is, you know, rallying different tribes in the you know, western regions of Saudi Arabia right now. But they filmed a lot of the movie in Jordan, and he obviously spent time in Jordan as well. And there are Nabatean, you know, ruins in southern Jordan, which I've also been to. And if you haven't been, that's another must do trip.
No, actually, I've been to Jordan at least 5 or 6 times now already.
Oh, great.
We have some good friends there, and that we're in touch with on a regular basis, and it's always a country we love to go. Actually, this week today we were meant to be in Jordan for a wedding, but sadly because of the current situation, we've not been able to travel, and obviously the wedding has been postponed to a later time. So we will be going back to Jordan sometime, hopefully later this year, and I hope this young couple will do eventually get married, and we'll go back. But you know, the current situation we're living to at the going through at the moment is something I've never experienced in my lifetime, and I think most people haven't either. On I went to and lived through different crises in many years, from terrorism attack to natural disasters to political coup and all sorts of other crises. But never I would have expected something of this nature, where we have an entire world on lockdown. People are not even able to go out of their house, or very limited movement. Entire aircraft fleets being grounded, no planes flying, um, and so much more. And this is really difficult situation. It's a health crisis. It's an economic crisis. It's a social crisis where people are actually, you know, I've been in our house now for nearly a month. And you know, the only interactions we've been having are actually in a virtual world. My sons are in different parts of the world. One was in Canada, was repatriated to France just 2 weeks ago. The oldest is in the UK, and we're separated, and we don't know when we're going to see each other again. It's a very, very difficult time for everyone.
It's really remarkable, and I have obviously a lot of sympathy for a wide range of people right now who are sort of, you know, stuck, not just physically stuck, but don't work in these ties, you know, or really don't have resilience in a way through digital connectivity to continue working. That's extremely troubling. And then, of course, those people, you know, we see the stories now every day who can't say goodbye to loved ones who are sick and who have literally, you know, tragically passed away, lost their lives to the virus. They can only, you know, FaceTime or Skype with them. And this is, you know, horrible. Some of the, you know, for many of us, if and when this does end, we'll look back at it, you know, memorably, may perhaps neither positively nor negatively, and just, you know, remember it as a really strange interregnum. But this is the traumatic event for human civilization as a whole. Nothing really compares, at least not in my lifetime.
Many people over the past few weeks have asked me the question that everybody has got in their mind is, when will this end? When are we going to go back to normal? And and to be honest, my answer is, first is, I don't know. If I knew exactly when we're going to go back to a more normalcy, um, I think I could probably bet some money and become really rich. But I think nobody really knows how long this is going to go. Um, I do believe strongly, however, that borders will not open in one snap. I believe that cities and states and countries will open to each other progressively. And how the travel industry, tourism industry will change moving forward is the big question that we all have in our mind at the moment. We do know that they will change. Will it change for the better? Will it change for more complexities in the way we have to travel in terms of health certifications or other means that we may have to go through in order to get visas to travel to different places? These are all questions that we're all asking ourselves at the moment, but we do believe they will be different. What are your views on the current situation and in terms of travel moving forward?
Well, it's, the crisis is one of overcapacity, right, in economic terms, because now we have a world population that, as you rightly point out, is, there's going to be precautionary savings, does not have as much income, discretionary income to go out and travel. Then there are going to be the persistent restrictions and obstacles with respect to whether or not one is, has a herd immunity certificate in their passport or not. A lot of caution, bilaterally, which countries will open up to other countries. First the Schengen area has to reopen, even for Europeans, which has been the most open cross-border zone in the world in recent decades. So it's really going to be a gradual recovery. And then the competition, really, to attract tourists and travelers and families and businesses for conferences and conventions. There's going to be fewer of them. So we have overcapacity. We're going to have a lot of underutilized capacity. A lot of hotels are not going to reach, full occupancy for a long time. And I think that is, and on top, beneath all of that, by the way, Mario, is this issue of the actual demographics of the world, because the world population is not growing in perpetuity. Actually the world population is starting to plateau and level off. So, increasingly we'll be competing more and more for fewer and fewer travelers, if you will, unless, of course, we were to have greater equality, and greater consumption, less poverty, more people able to consume, to move, to travel, to enjoy, whether it's for business or pleasure. And then we have the pressure to do all of that sustainably, right? Not to just have it return, to the old model. So all of these things kind of coexist. You have to stir them in a pot in a complex way. There's not just one factor to look at in terms of what's the right answer, where are people going to go. I think all of these macro kinds of issues, like the demographics and the economics and the sustainability pressures, are going to impact the tourism, the hospitality, and the aviation industries. So it is such an important one structurally, literally better than anyone, but it's worth repeating for everyone listening that, the hospitality industry, the tourism industry is more than 10% of GDP. It's more than 10% of global employment. You can only say that otherwise about maybe the construction industry, right? So this is really, and they obviously relate to each other as well, are so systemically relevant, so globally important, such an important part of the economies of so many countries and the livelihoods of so many families all over the world. And by every forecast, and measure and study that's out there right now, these are the ones that are going to take the longest to recover. So I do think that, there is sadly, or for better or worse, a lot of time right now for us to think about how to reinvent. You're again at the forefront, obviously, of thinking about it. We, as kind of, incubating a small digital travel company that is our daughters, we're thinking about it, emphasizing the family, emphasizing shared experience, emphasizing spending more time together, potentially in one place. And maybe those will become some of the new norms that the industry has to think about.
optimistic in me. I actually think that, this is a great opportunity for us to reinvent the tourism industry. There was a lot of concerns with over tourism in many destinations that was talked about before the crisis. Concerns that environmentally and it wasn't responsible and sustainable for the industry to continue to promote and encourage mass tourism. Um, and this is obviously a great opportunity for us to reinvent the industry, to realign ourselves to a new normal. Um, but on the other hand, I also know that it's very easy for everyone to fall back into their old habits, to go back to market sources that were easier to get before, and then to think, well, if we want to grow back because the economy has suffered so much, we all need to generate new incomes, we need to reemploy people, and etc. To fall back into the old habit of getting as many people as possible into a destination. So I'm very divided on this topic at the moment, where I see a great opportunity, and I have a desire to help destinations and to help businesses to move in the direction of being more responsible. But I also very concerned and afraid that the old habits will go back. Well, what are your views on this situation?
Again, I think it depends. So mass tourism really depends on, people's capacity, to travel en masse. Obviously, airline tickets are going to be, depressed in terms of prices. So it's certainly plausible that people, those who have the savings, who have the money to be able to do so, to get on a plane again and travel, in large numbers. And we're obviously seeing that in China. But Chinese people have a high savings rate. So even though they've suffered tremendously, from the coronavirus, and, had to restrict their mobility and incomes and business activity for a few months, we see them, recovering. And they're at least moving around within their own country a lot. So, those countries that are large, where there's lots to see and do, where it's cheap to move around, you can imagine them following the China model. Internationally, as we were saying before, it really depends on restrictions lifting and so forth. Then there's, countries, if you think about Italy, Spain, where tourism is a double-digit percentage of GDP, they perhaps don't have a choice, but to welcome or, seek to attract, lots of visitors again, but maybe try to do so in a more spread out way, in a year-round way, so that you don't have the kind of destruction of, urban habitats or heritage, architecture and ruins and this kind of thing. But again, as you know very well, that's a conversation that was taking place prior to the pandemic. So the pandemic shouldn't be the only reason why we think about this need to reinvent. This process of reinvention was sort of, beginning to happen. But you're right that there is a tension between the kind of economic necessity versus the kind of sustainability imperative. And I just think that much like the recovery in mobility and travel itself, it's not going to be a universal global thing at the same time. It's actually going to be sort of different countries at different speeds, if you will. But obviously, it would be good to see a sea change in a way in how the whole world thinks about these things, in the spirit of what you were saying at the beginning, which is that, this is the first time in human history that we have this synchronized kind of global standstill. So it is possible for us to do things collectively as humanity. It is possible, and let's see if, even though this was done as a reaction, let's see if the next things that we do will be, can be sort of proactive and positive and sustainable together.
When this is all over, how do you think you and your family's way of traveling will change? Do you think you will change the way you travel, the way you behave when you travel, or will we just go back to how it was before?
Well, I mean, we were certainly pretty nonstop. Zara's catching up to you in the country count. It's, 50 plus already, and she's only 10. And Zubin is a few behind because he's a couple of years younger. But, I think, we mix business and pleasure, I guess you could say. So, when we're traveling for work, we like to all go together somewhere and spend a little bit of extra time and immerse. But I do think immersion is very important to us. So if we can find the time to spend a couple of weeks somewhere rather than a couple of days, that's preferable. So you learn a lot more about a place. So, I think that I would like to do more immersion, if you will. That I think would probably be the way, and the one thing that might change in terms of how we do things, to kind of pick a place and spend more time there. And perhaps in a world that's more digitally connected, where one can kind of have work-life balance and not necessarily be at home, maybe the conditions will be more favorable for that kind of adjustment as well.
Yeah, I think what you described is what we refer to in our industry as bleisure, business and leisure, something that my wife and I actually practice very much too, as we travel for business from one place to another, especially if it's a place we've never been. We tend to book a couple of extra days or holiday and just hang around and go and explore and visit and enjoy it at the same time. And certainly we'll continue to practice that moving forward. And as we will be here in Thailand until for another year, and regrettably, in the last 7 years we've been here, we haven't actually really enjoyed Thailand that much. We've mostly been traveling overseas, so certainly plan to spend more time in doing some domestic tourism, which is I think probably the first area that will open up to the various destinations, and for us to go and explore this beautiful country that we live in, maybe a little bit more than we did before.
Exactly.
So where will be your next trip? What is the first place you want to go when this is all over?
Well, there's, a huge backlog of business travel, obviously. So to some degree, I'll be at the mercy of the dozens and dozens of events that have been canceled and need to be rescheduled. But those will be kind of, sprinkled into the schedule. As you know, Zara and I have been traveling from Scotland all the way back to Singapore by train, or various combinations of trains. So it's the longest overland rail journey that is geographically possible in the world. We made it as far as Almaty, Kazakhstan. And just as the virus hit in February, we were meant to be getting on a plane and flying to Urumqi in Western China to continue the journey. So we do have to prioritize that, and we want to. So once it's safe to do so, we will go back and to China, go all the way through China, all the way down to southern China, and then actually we will pass through and certainly visit you, because we'll go over the border to Chiang Mai, and the Eastern and Oriental Railway begins in Bangkok actually, but we'll come down from Chiang Mai and visit you with you, and get on the Eastern Oriental Railway and take that all the way down to Singapore, which will be the conclusion of that kind of grand Eurasian rail expedition.
Well, you and your wife and your family have a wonderful life, and maybe actually this could be the topic of our next discussions. Your travel journeys around the world sounds absolutely amazing. So as we're about to end, we've actually spent over 45 minutes together today, and I really appreciate you giving up some of your time to join us. Any last words of wisdom for the listeners?
Well, I obviously have to reflect a fair bit, because I just get asked, all the time by students, especially around the world, in the pre-pandemic world, let's say, what is your one advice to me, to us? And I always said, travel. It's the only way to build that competitive advantage, to see the world in different ways, immerse, learn languages, foreign cultures, relevant knowledge professionally. And it's harder, obviously. I haven't been lecturing students in the last few weeks, but I can imagine that I'm going to have a different answer now. As much as my heart says to continue to dispense that advice, my brain says, well, that's going to be harder for people to do. So it's food for thought, really, in terms of big systemic change. But the broader context of that advice always used to be mobility, right? Remember that from an economic standpoint, the most significant way in which a person can change their lot in life, their potential, is really two things. One is education, and the other is mobility. It's what you learn and where you live. And that is in many, many, many ways still true. So as much as, people, are people, young people in particular, are obviously still focused on those two things. Where are they going to be? Where can they enjoy a better life? So I still advocate mobility, thinking about, are you in the best place for you, for what you know, for the skills you have? And ultimately, for most people in the world, that still involves potentially moving from where they are. So still thinking about mobility, don't lose that dream of mobility, even though the world is in lockdown. That might be my parting words.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. Dr. Parag Khanna, it's been absolutely wonderful to spend time with you and to have this virtual coffee and tea together. You from Singapore, me from Bangkok. It's been an amazing time. And again, thank you very much for spending time with us this morning and sharing your point of view. One last question. When is your next book out?
Oh, well, that one is probably next year, though we might find a way to fast track it, because it is really about global migration and mobility and, the world population moving from what we today are calling red zones towards green zones or blue zones. So I'd actually finished the book at the end of last year. And I guess we'll see, the publishing industry, like many others, is suffering. So not sure exactly when it will come out, but the topic is certainly as relevant as ever. And I want to thank you as well, Mario, for having me on this, to join you for this conversation. It's been wonderful.
It's been great. I look forward to the next book. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Parag Khanna from Singapore, author, scientist, and futurist. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you. Take care.